3, 2, 1, let's go! Hi everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Boring JavaScript. I'm your host, the Virtuoid, aka Mike Smith, and today we're going to be talking about functions in JavaScript. That's right, one of the most fundamental concepts in JavaScript and pretty much all languages. Functions allow you to be able to group together a group of statements that you can call over and over and over again, with an optional set of data coming in and an optional set of data going back out. Very fundamental to JavaScript, very important to know, very easy, so let's get started. So how do you create functions in JavaScript? Well, you use the function verb. That's it. There's nothing else to it. So there are 5 different parts to a function that I want you to be aware of, and there are some little permutations here and there and some little exceptions to the rules. I'm not going to cover those in this video unless I feel like it. So if you ever have questions about that, look them up on the Mozilla Developer Network. You'll be great. But back to the 5 parts. The first part is the name of the function. If you're going to be calling your function later on in your code, you've got to give it some sort of name. In my case, I'm calling it isEven, which now means that when I want to call my function, I will have a constructor that looks like this on line 9, or a constructor that looks like this on line 10, where I just say isEven11 or isEven12. And it kind of looks like just a regular old JavaScript command. But instead, what JavaScript is going to do is say, isEven is not available. I mean, it's not like any verb I know, so is there been a function defined? And it will look into its code and say, yep, there has been a function defined. So in that case, I will execute that function. So therefore, if you're going to call your function somewhere in another part of your code, you've got to give it some sort of name. That's the first part. Second part is the arguments part. The arguments is the data you're going to pass into your function. It could be any number of arguments from 0 to however many your memory can actually hold. Normally people just have 3 or 4 and you should be okay at that point. For example, when I call my function here at line 9, I'm going to pass the number 11. When I call it on line 10, I'm going to pass that number 10. So what will happen is that when it gets into the function itself, it's going to assign the number 11 to the number variable, or it's going to assign the number 10 to the number variable. That variable is only available within the scope of the function. If I was to say, console.log number down here, it would say undefined, because number is not available outside of the scope of function. So the number that is created within the argument, which is a variable that will be assigned any values that gets passed into the function, and that variable is only available within the scope of the function. So that's step number 2, your variables within the array. Part number 3, or step number 3, is the curly Q brackets. Now the curly Q brackets defines the scope or the block in which your JavaScript variables will be executed for that function. So I know that all of this code here will get executed. Anything outside of that code will not get executed. Now, one little caveat here is that you don't really have to have the curly Q brackets. If you don't have them in there, JavaScript will just execute the very next line of code, and that's it. So that can get confusing for other developers, so I suggest, even if it's one line of code inside your function, always put curly Q brackets. It just makes life a little bit easier for everybody. So that's part number 3. Part number 4 is the actual code itself that gets executed. I'm not going to go over what it is. It's just regular old JavaScript code at that point. It can even call other functions if necessary. That's step 4. Step 5 is the return statement, and that part's very important. When a return statement is hit, the execution of the function ceases immediately, and a value is then returned back to whoever called it, whatever JavaScript code called it. So for example, if I happen to pass an even number here, it's going to check to find out if it's an even number, and then it's going to return true. At that point, it stops. It won't go any further. But if this happens to be a false value, an odd number, then it's going to skip the if, go to the else, and return a false. At that point, it's going to stop again and return false. So if I had something like this, console.log hi there, right here, hi there will never get executed because the return statement stops the execution of the function at that point and returns the value. Now, what do I mean by returning the value? Well, let's now go back to lines 9 and 10. On line 9 here, I call is even equals to 11. That's going to return a false because 11 is an odd number. So that's going to then assign false to is 11 even. Same thing here. Is even 10 is going to return true, and so it's going to assign the number or the true value to is 10 even. So I would expect is 11 even to be false and is 10 even to be true. And that's the fifth part in a nutshell, is that the return statement returns a value that then can be used. Now, if you don't want to use that value, that's fine. It just gets thrown away. If you don't have a return statement, then undefined is always returned from a function. So we got all this. Let's take a look and see how this program actually runs. So let's go into Node, and let's type in node function. Is 11 even? False. Nope, it's not even. Is 10 even? Yes, it is even because yes, because it says it's true there. So that shows you in a general nutshell how to be able to do functions. Back to the code here. Again, function verb, a name, any arguments, the block to which everything happens, the code itself, and then some way to return a value. So that's the basic fundamental way of creating functions inside JavaScript. Now, let's take a look at one of the newer concepts of JavaScript called arrow functions. We'll take a look at that now. So now let's talk about arrow functions in JavaScript. Now, arrow function is just the more concise way of creating a function. It does have one really critical difference that I'll discuss in my next segment, but for right now, let's just take a look at the construction of an arrow function. Here is the arrow function itself. It's a little different from how we constructed the functions before. Notice there's no function verb. There is also no name here. And because there's no name, if you wish to use it in your JavaScript code like I want to in lines 9 and 10 here, I have to assign it to some sort of variable, which I've done here, constant is even. Just like we had function is even before, now I have constant is even. So with my arrow construction here, I'm assigning it to a variable so I can use it a little bit later on before. The equals and greater than sign that appears between the arguments and the block, which is the curly Q brackets, is basically the replacement for the function verb, and it is what gives the arrow function its name. Other than that, it's exactly the same. Here are the arguments. The arguments always are always first in an arrow function. You do not have to have the parentheses if you don't want to. Only for one variable. If you have more than one argument. If you have more than one argument, you need parentheses. If you only have one argument, you don't need parentheses. I personally like to have parentheses all the time. Just in my opinion, it makes it easier to code. Other than that, everything is exactly the same. You have the curly Q brackets, you have the code, and you have the return statement. And the return statement is obviously returns a value. And if there's no return statement within this block, it returns undefined. Do you have to have a block just like in the function? No. If you do not, it's going to execute whatever one statement and one statement only that you have after the arrow function, which I'll show you here in just a minute. And then I'll show you how the return works in that too. So this should work exactly the same as our function does. So let's flip over to Node and let's type in node arrow. Is 11 even? False. Is 10 even? True. Yes. So it worked exactly the same way. So why even do this if you're going to, if you have a function, why do you even need arrow functions? So let's flip back over to the code and show you something really funky that you can do with the arrow functions. I'm going to flip down to the bottom here and I'm going to copy this code. And I'm going to replace the whole shoot and match here. In fact, what I'm going to do here, just kind of so we can compare the two, what I'm going to first do here is I'm going to comment out this code and then put the new code up here. This code does the exact same thing as the other code. This is the most concise type of arrow function you can get. Earlier I said if you only have one argument, you don't need parentheses, so I have taken out the parentheses for the argument itself. Again, I like parentheses, but just for the sake of this video, I've taken them out. Here's my arrow function. Here is the function itself. Notice there are no curly Q brackets. Because there's no curly Q brackets, what it's going to do is it's going to execute this particular snippet of code, and only one snippet of code is allowed. It's basically just some operators within a particular variable, and it will return the result of that operation. What's the result of this operation? Well, first of all, I'm taking the number modulo 2, or remainder of 2, and this is either going to reproduce a number of 0 or a number of 1. If it produces a number of 0, then the variable is even. If it produces a number of 1, it has a remainder of 1, so the variable is odd. Well, we want even to be true and 0 to be false, so we've got to flip those numbers, because remember, in JavaScript, 0 is a falsy value and 1 is a truthy value. So if we not, which is the little not symbol there, if we not a 0, it becomes a 1. And if we not the 1, it becomes a 0, because false becomes true and true becomes false. So we flip the 2 around to make sure our is even works out correctly. Confused? Don't worry about it, but work through this. This is the most concise way you can do an arrow function. Again, no parentheses if there's only one argument, and if there's no curly Q brackets, it returns the result of whatever operation you've done within this one single operation. Let's flip over to Node and take a look at that. In fact, I'll just execute it again from right here. Yep, exact same thing. So that's one of the ways that's different between a arrow function and a regular function, is that you can get your functions really super nice and concise. But there's one extremely important difference between the two that you really need to be aware of, and we'll cover that next. So what's that big difference between an arrow function and a normal function that I talked about earlier? Well, let's take a look at some code here. First of all, the code that I have is a normal object. I've got a property in the object, and I've got 2 functions associated with the object. This first function is a normal function. The second function is an arrow function. And within each one of them, I've just got a little console.log saying which function I'm inside, and I'm constantly log out this. So what I should expect here is, inside a normal function, this is always associated with the object to which it belongs. A top-level function belongs to the global object. This particular function belongs to the animal object. So I should expect born to say, when it says console.log, I should expect it to show animal, and I should also expect the arrow function to show the animal. So let's take a quick look at that. Let's go over to Node, and let's type in Node this, and you think you pretty much guess what's going to happen here. Aha, yes, something completely different than what was expected happened. What happened? Well, it all depends upon how this is defined within a normal function and within an arrow function. I kind of gave you a clue before then. A arrow function, let me flip back over to our code here. An arrow function, a normal function, the this is always defined within the scope that the function was defined. So if you define the function at the global level, it will be the global object. If you define it within the object, this will be part of the object. So when we go back over to Node here, you can see that definitely, yes, this is the animal object. But what about walk? Well, if an arrow function doesn't take this from its containing object, it normally takes this from, it normally thinks of itself as being created on the global object. And this global object could be Windows, it could be, if you're in a module, it could be blank, or it could be whatever global object you happen to be defined within the scope of your JavaScript code that you've got. So basically, an arrow function will define this based upon the global scope, while a function within an object will base upon whatever it was created from. So this is, for an arrow function, in this particular case, this will be blank. Now, a caveat here, honestly. There's a lot of different permutations of how this is defined, and I really suggest looking up on it. What I've given you here is a very generic overview, and you can always point to things that may be a little bit different here and here. But, you know, so look it up if you really want to get technical down to the details of what it is. But in general, a normal function, this is defined, or takes its this from the defining object, or the scope of the object in which it's defined, while an arrow function will always take it from the global object. Why is that important? Well, if you're doing functional type programming, you want to keep the amount of variables that you have access to as limited as possible. And the biggest or the most tightest definition of functional programming, everything that happens within the function can only happen within the function. No access to outside variables, nothing. So you bring in the variable in for the argument, You do whatever you have to do, and you send out the value. You have absolutely no access to anything else. And arrow functions attempts to start to give you that. So if you go back, let's go back over to node here and take a look at our node function. When we're inside the born function itself, we have access to this, which means technically we have access to the outside world, and something could change in the outside world that we're not expecting to change, and it could change the results of our function. But this is blank within walk. So therefore, nothing or everything can change in the outside world, and walk is never going to be affected because it's only looking within its own little self. So that's the great thing about arrow functions, is that because of how it is scoped, especially within this, it limits the amount of data that is available to you or available to you within the function that you can operate on. And that's great for functional type programming. Where it doesn't have advantages is like I used here. If you're going to use arrow functions, do not use them as methods in classes, or do not use them as functions within an object here where you have to access this. Now, if you're not accessing this, technically you can go ahead and do it, but be general. Let's generalize here. Don't use the functions. Don't use an arrow function where you have to be able to access this. Use a normal function. And that's the really big difference between an arrow function and a normal function in how it operates with this. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. Read the Mozilla Developers Network documentation on it, and it will tell you everything you need to know. But basically, just remember that, and you'll be great, and you'll have a lot of fun working with arrow functions. And that's all there is to functions in JavaScript. I hope you enjoyed our video. Hope I didn't bore you to death. Please see all of our videos at www.boringjavascript.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out everything we do at blog.thevirtuoid.com. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you later.